and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is a religious leader. He's also considered by many to be amongst the world's wealthiest men. He also supports and manages one of the world's largest philanthropic organizations. I'm delighted to welcome His Highness the Aga Khan. Your Highness, you're a religious leader of the Ismaili community, an inspiration to millions of Muslims around the world. We have traditionally associated religious leaders with austerity and sort of denial, in a sense. You embody a fullness of life. What is the worldview that circumscribes your work as an imam?
There's a very important point to make here, which is that Islam doesn't make the division that you've just made between faith and world. We are required to live in both and to live properly in both. I think it's essentially the Christian world that has tended to make a division between leaders of the faith and worldly matters. In fact, I would go further and I would say even that today is tending to disappear, because it's clear that religious leaders have responsibilities that they fulfill, they have authority that they can use properly, they have institutional resources. So the point I would make is that in the fullness of my responsibility, it's the fullness of my life.
But sometimes do you find that, when you run businesses, for example, that there is a greater potential for conflict? We traditionally associate issues of business with not really being ethical and not really sort of following the moral framework and structures. So is that ever a conflict for you?
No, I did have a period in my life when I had some direct personal entrepreneurial activities. That's 20 years ago. I've given everything up. The Aga Khan Development Network has got the Aga Khan Fund for Economic Development, which invests in economic activities, but specifically in the developing world. And the only personal activity that I have is the bloodstock activity, which I inherited from my family, and that I have tried to maintain as best I could. But otherwise, I have practically no personal entrepreneurial activity whatsoever.
You're a direct descendant from the Prophet. Is that something that you feel sort of constantly conscious of? Is there a mystical dimension to it? Is there how does that sort of play out for you?
I think one of the specifics of Islam is that you live your faith, and you're not one day in your faith and the next day out of your faith. It's a permanent presence. It's a presence which brings you happiness, it brings you objectives in life, and therefore I don't think that one can make this sort of dichotomy. It's a permanency of thought, of attitude, of ethics. So that's really what it is.
But are they sort of, there are presumably rituals and practices that go with it. So are you in that sense a practicing Muslim, or is this more a philosophical framework?
It's both. It's both.
So how significant are the ritualistic, the practices that are involved?
Well, I think you have to be clear in both. But as I said, you live the faith. It's not that if you're in a meeting on a given issue that you forget that behind the decisions you are taking are the ethical principles of your faith. And they have to be there all the time, whatever you're doing.
Well, there is obviously sort of diverse interpretations of the faith, and sort of the more sort of fundamentalist aspects of it. Don't take interest, don't sort of in terms of loans, debts. Do you feel sort of compromised in, or let's say that to other practitioners of the faith from other traditions, Islamic traditions, feel that you have somewhat compromised that understanding of Islam?
Not at all. We have a number of agencies. The vast majority are not-for-profit agencies. And where they are for profit, it is because they have a development purpose, and it is very difficult, frankly, to carry out a development program if you don't renew your resources. So you have to renew your resources. The important point, I think, is to give everybody a choice. It is actually the individual in society who must make the choice. It is he or she that makes that choice. As long as the choice is available, I feel comfortable.
In what ways do you feel that you have helped or you have contributed to the reinterpretation or the revitalization of Islam to make it more contemporary?
I think there are issues in the Islamic world that have been difficult to deal with. One has been, for example, the physical environment and the expression of culture in architecture, in environmental work, in art, music, etc. But there are other areas also. Governance, good governance, principles of public consultation. Democracy, after all, is a form of government that is now becoming very, very prevalent. But it doesn't mean that it's necessarily good government. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily government which is effective for the people that it is supposed to serve. So we are living at a time when there are a number of fragile democracies in our world, and not specifically in the Islamic world. But the bridge between the notion of a modern democracy and issues of public consultation, meritocracy, these are all issues which bridge Islamic ethics and modern governance. And that is a very important area which I've been working in. I've been working in also in interpretation, clearly. As you said, there are numerous interpretations in Islam. And there the key issue is the acceptance of pluralism. The Ismaili community itself is pluralist.
You're watching a conversation with His Highness the Aga Khan. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away.
Actress बनना, it's like a dream come true. सोचिए ना, राजस्थान में shooting, horse riding, dance sequences, और आसपास कुछ नहीं. Not even a bathroom. और ये सब period के second day पे. But I don't let it stop me. क्योंकि मेरे पास है Whisper Ultra. इसमें है 5 गुना ज्यादा सोखने की शक्ति, यानी गीलेपन का एहसास ही नहीं, ताकि घंटों बाद भी I can go on and chase my dreams. Whisper Ultra. Stay protected घंटों तक.
दर्द में भी कुछ बात है. दर्द श्वेत है, दर्द श्याम है. कभी रास्ता, कभी मुकाम है.
कंधा, कमर या घुटना, कुछ भी हो तकलीफ,
हिमानी फास्ट रिलीफ दर्द मिटाए चुटकी में. सर्दियों में आपकी त्वचा को चाहिए एक सुरक्षा कवच, वरना नमी गायब, रूखापन, त्वचा खिंची खिंची से हो जाती है. आपको चाहिए बोरोप्लस का सुरक्षा कवच, ताकि त्वचा की नमी बरकरार रहे, उसे रूखा ना होने दे. बोरोप्लस एंटीसेप्टिक क्रीम, इसे पहने रखिएगा हमेशा.
अब 19 ग्राम बोरोप्लस के साथ एक माधुरी शैम्पू सैशे और 40 ग्राम के साथ एक शैम्पू बॉटल मुफ्त.
हसमुख भाई, जैसे आप भी अपने आप को कर ले रिचार्ज रिवाइटल से. जल्दी जाइए और ले आइए रिवाइटल ट्रायल पैक सिर्फ 55 रुपए में.
Welcome back to a continuing conversation with His Highness the Aga Khan. We were talking about pluralism and accountability in governance in Islam. What are the elements of where in Islam does this derive from? It's a popular perception that democracy is a Greco-Roman concept, and where does it come from in Islam?
Right after the passing away of Prophet Muhammad, there were processes of determination of what governance would be after his lifetime. And there were two interpretations. One was the hereditary interpretation, which is essentially the essence of Shia Islam. There was a consultational process amongst leaders of the community at the time to select what was believed to be the most appropriate and most competent leader. And therefore two principles or three principles were established at the time. Heredity, secondly consultation, thirdly competence. If you look at modern states, they're all there in one form or the other. So I think it's important to see how these forces, which were logical, proper forces that existed just after the time of Prophet Muhammad's death, they are still in the Islamic Ummah today, and indeed outside.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about how you're anguished at the way Islam is perceived in much of the world, and 9/11 and the conflicts in the Middle East. And much of your work now is being directed to education, to sort of reinterpreting, looking at Islam afresh. So what kind of new look, what kind of new interpretation would you hope that to bring about Islam?
Well, let me go back to the basics of the modern world. If it is correct, as I think it is, that we will be living in the next 10, 20 years with a large number of young states not very experienced in democracy, in good governance, etc. The sustenance of improvement in quality of life, I think, will occur through civil society. I think it is civil society, and indeed India is a case in point, where civil society institutions will be the institutions to which people will refer for continuing improvement. That's really the area of my primary work, and therefore everything that affects civil society is a primary concern to me. Yes, we have been looking at new issues. We've been looking at issues, for example, of teaching on pluralism. We've been looking at issues of teaching on ethics. We've been looking at issues about teaching on the environment.
But are these circumscribed by an Islamic worldview, or in some ways secular worldview?
No. They are value systems which are as appropriate, and they are sourced in the Islamic world. I mean, all these issues are referenced in many, many ways in the Islamic world. But they're global values. They're universal values.
You say that the Ismaili community and under your leadership, is this a process of reinterpreting Islam to make it relevant to the modern world, or in some ways perhaps sort of lifting off the veils of traditional Islam, which was always sort of dynamic and unfolding?
Yes. I don't see any conflict in the way I interpret Islam between the intellect and faith. And insofar as people's knowledge today is significantly different from what it was 1,300 years ago, we have to live in our time. And indeed, I would vigorously oppose anybody who would claim that the faith of Islam cannot be of the 20th or 21st or 23rd, 25th century.
What would you say to sort of your Islamic brothers, such as Osama bin Laden and others, who sort of, in the name of Islam, are wielding so much terror?
I have to say very frankly that I don't accept the notion that the faith of Islam is associated with terrorism. I have to say very frankly that in my interpretation, just about every area where we have conflict, in the Islamic world and outside, is essentially driven by political issues, either historic issues that we've inherited, problems that have not been solved. 1947 partition in India. The Middle East, what is it? It's the result of the First World War, decades ago. And these are problems which we've inherited, which have not been solved. And I think we need to give more time, A, to solving those problems, and secondly, predicting where things can go wrong. A lot of these issues are actually predictable, but they're not addressed in good time.
So how intense is your feeling of anguish that much of the violence and the terror in the world is ascribed to Islam, and 9/11 and thereafter in particular has bred a great deal of prejudice and hostility to the faith and people who manifest that faith?
As I said, I think it's wrong to associate the totality of a highly pluralist faith in many parts of the world, many communities, many backgrounds, many languages, with individual specificities. I'll give you an example. I doubt that any educated person would have seen in Northern Ireland a representation of the Catholic faith or the Protestant faith. And yet, what was it? It was a conflict of two communities. But it was pitched into the context of faith conflict. But to extrapolate from that one situation and say that one situation illustrates the whole of the way attitudes of these faiths would be totally wrong. Then if you apply that equity to the way you interpret the situation in Northern Ireland, and there are many others, then let's apply the same equity to the Islamic world.
You've been initiating projects in much of the Islamic world where you're looking at traditional Islamic education, the madrasas. So what is your striving in those kinds of initiatives to use the madrasas for change?
Well, what happened is that the madrasa historically went through a lot of evolution, and in fact it went up to the great madrasas of Central Asia, which were in fact universities. So today what we're talking about is pre-primary education, going right up practically to higher education. And my sense is that today the specificity of education needs to be consolidated into a global form of education so that the individual can live in the real world today. And this divide that used to happen between education in faith and education in the real world is one which I think we have to reconsider. And in fact, many Muslim communities are doing that, and we've, I think, helped them to do that. That doesn't mean you give up education and religion. What it means is that you complete it so that if you enter the educational process, you enter into a complete stream rather than a split stream.
You know, there is the popular perception that the madrasas in Pakistan, for example, and several Muslim countries, have been the training ground, the breeding ground for future militants. So isn't this a way of sort of bringing reform into Islam, and translating that into society in some ways?
I think many Muslim countries have already completed the reform of the madrasa. In East Africa, for example, we've been significantly involved in that activity. In Pakistan, there is a process of reformation of the madrasa, and I think the aim is, as I said, to round out the educational process. The second one is to introduce notions of quality, because notions of quality have been uneven. The faculty that teach in madrasas, teaching is a profession today. And it needs to be done professionally.
You know, you've spoken about the quality of education, you've spoken about issues of plurality, and again a popular perception of Islam is that it tends to be inclusive and not as tolerant and accepting of diversity. What are the elements in Islam for you that recommend pluralism, that recommend diversity?
Well, I mean, I think the ethics themselves are very clear. That is, the society in which you live is the society which you care for, and there is not a great deal of distinction between whether you care for this community or that community. What you seek is a quality of life for everybody, which is one which can be valued. So I think we have to be careful not to say that Islam is exclusive. It's not exclusive. Indeed, it's probably the most inclusive of all the monotheistic faiths, if only because it was the last monotheistic faith revealed.
You're watching a conversation with His Highness the Aga Khan. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away.
साधारण च्यवनप्राश काफी नहीं, सोना चांदी च्यवनप्राश खाओ, जिसमें है असली सोना और चांदी, जो दे सुपर स्वस्थ तन। सोना चांदी च्यवनप्राश।
अनजान नहीं है दुनियादारी से, फिर भी दिल की सुनते सुनाते हैं। कुछ लोग सूमो चलाते हैं। सूमो विक्टर, आपकी पहचान।
लुई हूँ मैं, बीमारी जब फैलाऊं, गोल गोल खिलौनों से खेलना मैं चाहूँ, जैसे बॉल और गोल कॉइल।
आ गया नया मॉर्टीन पावर बूस्टर कॉइल। गोल कॉइल की मोटाई एक समान, पर मॉर्टीन कोनों पर है ज्यादा मोटा, तभी हर आधे घंटे पे छोड़े पावर बूस्टर्स, शक्तिशाली सुरक्षा।
इजी नरम गरम ऑफर, अब नए गोदरेज इजी के साथ निविया क्रीम फ्री।
Welcome back to a continuing conversation with His Highness the Aga Khan. What brings you to India?
I've come here because the Aga Khan Award for Architecture will be held here, and I'm very, very happy because it's been a hope of everybody connected with the award to hold this ceremony here.
What is the significance of the Aga Khan giving an award for architecture? Yeah. Why architecture? What's the importance of that?
I think what happened was I have been involved in building for many, many years, and I started asking myself, what's happened to the great traditions of Islamic architecture? And there are many of them. And I had the feeling that this area of cultural activity had actually lost its momentum, lost its sense of direction. And I shared that query with many other Muslims and non-Muslims, and they all agreed. So then the question was, how do you change cultural attitudes and revitalize them, give them new areas of knowledge? And that's the source of the award, was to try to create a new momentum. A new momentum not only looking backwards. Sometimes people say, well, you can only be legitimate if you look backwards. That's not true. Let's look forwards. Let's design great architecture for the future. Protect the past and inspire the future.
In India, if you travel around and you see that there are such sort of conflicting architectural styles, in the sense of mise en scène of architecture, a presence has declined. Why is architecture, just a larger philosophical question, because you're contributing so much to its promotion, why is architecture important?
Well, let me call it habitat first, not architecture. The award's called the Award for Architecture, but it applies to the physical environment in which people live, and in countries like India, others, the rural environment is infinitely more important than the urban environment. I mean, you have, whatever it is, 80% of the population of India lives in the rural environment. Therefore, we're looking at all aspects. And what we found very early on is that in the processes of change and improvement in quality of life, people invest in improving their habitat. And the question is, can we help them to do that in a more effective way, where they get better design, better quality of life from what they invest in the physical environment?
If I could conclude on a personal question, what is, you radiate so much sort of happiness, you radiate a kind of glow. What is the prescription for happiness for you?
The role I have is a remarkable privilege. It's to be able to help people. And in that sense, when I have a feeling that some of the things that are being done do actually cause change and positive change, that's a source of immense happiness.
Is it sometimes personally difficult? Is it constricting in any way occasionally?
It's demanding because the world demands are greater than ever before, because the range of Imamat activities is greater than it's ever been, because we're working in more countries, countries where there is an Ismaili community, countries where there is not an Ismaili community. We are looking at changes in governance. As I said, we talked about democracy.
But personally, what's most difficult? The fact that you're under scrutiny all the time? Can you be humanly fallible?
The most difficult is managing time. That's the most difficult aspect of my life.
Well, Her Highness, thank you very much for creating time to be on this program from your very busy schedule, which has been away for 15 years. But I hope we'll talk again on this program soon. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.